Ja, guten Abend, good evening, herzlich willkommen im DAI. Mein Name ist Lena Jünk, ich bin hier Programmdirektorin. Ich werde diese Einführung auf Englisch machen, weil ja auch unsere Veranstaltung heute auf Englisch stattfindet und damit Kim Wehle mich auch verstehen kann. So ist, glaube ich, besser, oder? In our role as a place of free spirit oder ein Ort des freien Geistes hier at the DAI seeks to provide spaces for thoughtful engagement with complex topics. The questions of this evening touch on fundamental principles of democracy, constitutional governance, and the independence of judicial institutions. Themes that resonate deeply both in the United States and also here in Germany. We are exceptionally fortunate to have with us tonight one of America's foremost constitutional scholars, Professor Kim Wehle. Professor Wehle brings extraordinary expertise and insight to our discussion, particularly on matters of constitutional law and the separation of powers. Professor Wehle is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where she teaches constitutional law, civil procedure, administrative law, and federal courts. Currently, she is serving as a Fulbright scholar at Leiden University in the Netherlands, where she is conducting research on how citizens across 6 global democracies understand and internalize constitutional norms. Her scholarly contributions extend well beyond academia, which is also a reason why we have her here with us tonight. Professor Wehle has authored 4 important books that make complex legal concepts accessible to the general public, including How to Read the Constitution and Why, What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, and How to Think Like a Lawyer and Why, a common sense guide to everyday dilemmas. Her most recent book, Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why, was published last year in fall. Many of you may recognize Professor Wehle from her frequent media appearances. She currently serves as a legal contributor for ABC News and regularly writes for publications such as Politico and The Atlantic. And last week, she appeared as one of 35 legal experts on an important essay published in the New York Times. And I really recommend you to read this. It's called The Recklessness Itself Sends a Message. 35 legal experts assess Trump's return. With Donald Trump's return to the White House in January, we are witnessing unprecedented tests of constitutional norms and judicial independence in the United States. Kim Wehle has been examining what many describe as a constitutional crisis, analyzing the implications of executive orders, challenges to judicial authority, and the broader impact of executive power on democratic institutions. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Kim Wehle.
Thank you so much for that very gracious invitation, and I'm grateful for all of you for coming tonight. This is a topic that I have been talking about for many years now. I started out just in legal scholarship and teaching about the Constitution in American law schools, and then when Donald Trump first took office, I was actually reading a column in the New York Times that had a statement about the Constitution that wasn't entirely accurate. And it was actually about, of all things, the president's power to pardon federal crimes And the New York Times author said, the pardon power is like a king. There are no restraints on the pardon power. And that was then. This is now. Things have frankly changed in the last few years when it comes to the president's power, according to the United States Supreme Court. But that back then I said, no, that can't be right. If the president were to take a bribe for a pardon, that would be a problem. Or if the president were to only pardon people of Caucasian descent and not pardon people that are people of color, that would be a problem under another part of the Constitution. And that sort of triggered this passion of mine around explaining legal concepts to regular Americans and now many people across the world. I've been on many radio and television programs all over Europe and Africa and Australia. I've even had numerous requests from China, which I have said no so far. But and as you could notice from the introduction, my 4 books all have and why, because my philosophy around understanding the Constitution and around teaching about the law in the United States is that if you understand the why, then you can figure out the what a little better and more easily for yourself. So I'll tell you one example that I use a lot, both with lay audiences and with experts, which I think sums up where we are in the United States when it comes to the U.S. Constitution. I'm asked a lot of times, is that constitutional? Can he do that? And my response is, it's the wrong question. The question is really, if he, and you could fill in the blank, who I mean, if he does that, is there a consequence? If there's no consequence, the answer to whether he can do that is yes. In a way, it doesn't really matter what the Constitution says. What matters is if it's enforced. So the example I use is a speed limit. We drive down the road, it'll say 50 kilometers per hour. In the United States, it's miles per hour. And we all know in the United States, if you go 9 miles over the speed limit, you won't get a ticket. That's if it's a police officer, but if it's a machine hiding in the bushes, it'll give you a ticket for whatever speed you're going over the speed limit. People will go through the speed limit until they get the ticket. Then everyone slows down. In the few blocks near my house where that machine is hiding in the bushes, all the cars slow down. Once they know they've passed it, they speed up. So it's not the speed limit that slows people down. It's not the law that slows people down or stops people from acting illegally or badly. It's the consequence for violating the law. It's the disincentive for violating the law. And what my conclusion is, and this has been the case for a few years now, is that there aren't any tickets for speeding in the Oval Office in the United States anymore. And frankly, this column, this that I was privileged to be part of with the New York Times, with 34 other legal experts and scholars across the country, the consensus now is that we're in a red light moment in American democracy. We are in deep trouble when it comes to the Constitution. So I don't have to persuade, but I will anyway tonight. And I preface this with it is not an uplifting conversation. Don't shoot the messenger, as we say in the U.S. I'm doing my best, but I think it's really important to understand what's going on if there's any chance of turning things around. If I don't know how my engine works in my car and it breaks down, I'm stuck by the side of the road. I'm not going to get it going again because I don't understand how it works. So my talk proceeds in 4 parts. And forgive me if you know a lot about the U.S. Constitution. You probably know more than a lot of Americans. when I started this in 2015, there's a survey that's done every year out of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And it asks 3,000 Americans about the Constitution. And 10 years ago, only 1/3 could name the three branches, could name them: judicial, executive, and legislative. Even more terrifying, frankly, is a different study back in 2015 found that 10% of college graduates in the United States thought that the television show star Judge Judy was on the United States Supreme Court. Now, one of the silver linings of the Trump era is that statistic has flipped. Now, 2/3 of Americans can name the three branches. So what used to be kind of this dusty area of law, I would write constitutional law exams and have to make up crazy hypotheticals that could never happen. And now we far exceeded anything I could have imagined. Now people are talking about it. So I'm going to go over a few constitutional basics in the way I teach American lawyers how to do it. But if it's redundant, you can see, at least hear my framing of it. The second is, if you haven't noticed, there's a tsunami, an onslaught of executive orders and actions coming out of the White House. It's impossible even for someone like myself to keep up with it. I'm not a tennis player. I broke my ankle a few years ago and learned better. But I do feel like it's like playing tennis with multiple ball machines. It's impossible to hit every ball. They're just coming at you. But I'm going to highlight some of the things, and it's discussed in the New York Times column, that collectively are some of the most serious when it comes to American democracy. There's a lot I could say about how did we get here, why are we here, but I'll get some highlights on that and what my thoughts are for what's next. Now, I've been in the Netherlands now since February, and there's various reactions to what's happening in the United States from people that I've met in Europe, varieties of reactions. But I just want to say a few threshold things. One is that there really is a difference between American government, the current government, and the American people. That really needs to be distinguished in our minds as we move forward. Some of the reasons that we are here do have to do with the American population, some do not. And I think there is an energy within the American populace to not be where we are right now, to find ways of more connection and to get out of the polarization that is such a problem. The other big takeaway, and I'm interested if we have time for questions, to keep in mind is that I do think even though this is American democracy, its fate, what happens, does affect the rest of the planet, particularly our allies here in Europe that rely not only on the American military support, the American economy, but also we're the oldest written constitution. The Netherlands is the second, and it is sort of a bellwether. I know there's democratic backsliding in other parts of the world, including in Germany and certain factions. But it's very, very serious in the United States. We are, as others experts in authoritarianism and fascism, we are in that arena now. So with that, here's my basic, for a seventh grader explanation of what is the American Constitution, how is it different from what is happening right now in the United States. That is, it's a rejection of an unlimited monarchy where the power, in theory, came from the divine right of kings, and it trickles down to the population based on whether certain people or certain factions of people are within the good graces of the king or not. It's very subjective. It's very arbitrary. There are winners and losers based on whether the king decides you are a winner or a loser. The framers of the U.S. Constitution, those who fought the Revolutionary War, inverted that triangle and put we the people, well, of course, the three critical words to the preamble to the United States Constitution, put them in charge and put the king, so to speak, the president, at the bottom of the triangle. Now, what Americans don't like is that having it this way is messy. You cannot get consensus. You have to make compromises. It's pluralistic, so there's a lot of different people that have to be brought into the fold. And it's not efficient in some ways. It's bureaucratic and takes a long time. And our current president ran on a lot of different things, but one of the things was, listen, if you give me the power, I can make changes very rapidly. I don't have to bother with all of the complexities of this system of government that was established to prevent this, to prevent unlimited power being accumulated in one branch, let alone one person. Now, there is a theory running around in academic circles. It's took a life of its own politically within the second Bush administration and the war on terror. It's called the unitary executive theory. It's in academic journals, but now it's made its way into policy. And the theory is, yeah, sure, we've inverted the triangle, but the framers only chose one person to be president and vested in the president in Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive power and the power to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And then literally an argument is being made right now within the far right, and then frankly in the Trump administration and the Republicans that are dominating both houses of Congress, that really what this is supposed to be is this, because of this idea of Article 2 lodging executive power in one person, not in a committee. Okay, so when I talk about the Constitution to lay audiences, I talk about it like two axes. The original Constitution had no actual specific rights, no delineated individual rights. The idea, the notion was that if we take the king and we break the king into three heads and each branch gets their papers graded by the other two branches, no power is in one place. We don't really need individual rights. We don't need specific provisions for protecting liberty against a bullying king, because nobody can become king. And each branch in theory will want to jealously guard and keep its power. People like power, right? Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, which was kind of the propaganda exchange that was circulated to encourage people to support ratification of the Constitution. He wrote, ambition needs to be made to counteract ambition. You need tickets for speeding. He also wrote, if men were angels, we would not need government. That if we all just could rely on the good conscience and integrity of people, we wouldn't need checks and balances. We wouldn't need tickets for speeding. Everybody would slow down and just comply with whatever the rules are. That might be more the case in Germany. It's certainly not the case in the United States that people like to follow all the rules. Axis 2, however, shortly after ratification of the Constitution, there were certain states that limited or made contingent their agreement to ratify the Constitution, a pledge to add some specific rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. They contain the big one of the biggies, the First Amendment. More than 50% of Americans can name one of the rights, which is the freedom of speech in the First Amendment, but under 50% can name any other right in the First Amendment, including freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of association or assembly, right? That's all in the First Amendment, for example. Second Amendment has this crazy stuff about guns, which I can talk about at length. But there's our first 10 amendments. And so I'll ask American audiences, I'll say, okay, so you've got rights. We have some express articulated rights. What does that even mean to you? This is the and why, the kind of breaking things down into common sense language. And usually someone will raise their hand and say, it's just mine. I'm born with it. It's my right. And we saw this during the COVID pandemic. My right to not wear a mask. We're now seeing it. My right to not be vaccinated versus my right to have my child safe from a deadly disease that could be prevented if the community was vaccinated. Or my child to be safe from COVID by requiring masks. These are the rights. But then I'll say, well, imagine, okay, you have a right to go in your home. That's protected in theory under the Fourth Amendment, which requires warrants before the police can arrest you or search your home. That was a reaction to general warrants under the British monarchy, where they could just rifle through anything because the king felt like it. And I'll say, imagine you have a right to go in your home. You're paying your mortgage. You're paying your rent. But one day you show up and there's all these armed police officers surrounding your home. What happens to your right? And eventually a hand will go up and say, well, I guess I have to go to the police. And say, well, that's not a good answer anymore, because the police are the ones that are not allowing you into your house. And eventually someone will raise their hand and say, I guess I have to go to a judge and get a judge to issue an order. So again, the judge is issuing that ticket for speeding to the police. It's the enforcement through Axis 1, the separation of powers, the holding accountable, the abuse of power that actually protects your rights. The rights on themselves don't have their own police force. They don't have human beings to actually enforce them. So I give these little cheat sheet to folks. It's very helpful. I gave a speech in February in Florida before I came to the Netherlands to a population of retired folks in an area of Florida called the Villages. There are large populations of retired community, people in retirement communities. Most of them are, more than 50% are MAGA. They're very pro-Trump. And that talk actually went really well. They gave a standing ovation, believe it or not. And one of the things I explained, because people would say, yeah, well, the federal courts are acting unconstitutionally. Yeah, well, this is unfair to the president. Is, you know, we have my little cheat sheet. Here's the branch of government. You just go down. If you think the executive can do it, no, there's actually judges get to check to grade the papers of the executive. It's a very helpful way among many that I have up my sleeve of getting out of the right, wrong, Democrat, Republican, blue, red, my team, your team, polarized mentality, and encouraging people to think critically in an objective way. So that's the basics of the Constitution set up. And my argument is that if you come now down to here, and we can go through that in some detail, there's actually many more checks for the president. I did a thought experiment in 2022 with my students. I think we got to 25 or 26. Even after the first Trump administration, with the exception of a criminal indictment, most of them had pretty much gone by the wayside. There were not tickets issued for speeding through these checks and balances. And if you noticed, last summer, in June of 2024, the United States Supreme Court took the last check really out of the Constitution, which is accountability for the president committing crimes using the massive powers of his office. So, most people would understand after that they can pretty much do what they want with the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Justice, the United States military, because there's no tickets for speeding through the judicial branch when it comes to criminal accountability. Okay, so what are we seeing now? And I'm not blaming it all on the Supreme Court, but they are actually a lot to blame the Supreme Court. So what are we seeing now? Here are some key areas of concern. Due process clause. It's actually two places in the U.S. Constitution. It's in the Fifth Amendment, which binds the federal government. It's in the 14th Amendment, which was a post-Civil War amendment, binds the states. Dates back to the Magna Carta in England. It means you get notice that you did something wrong, and you get an opportunity to be heard before a judge before someone can take your life, execute you, take your liberty, throw you in jail, or take your property. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland man from I'm from Maryland, or I live in Maryland, and hundreds of others were deported to El Salvador, to a foreign prison with no notice and no opportunity to be heard. And the Trump administration's position is, and I think correctly, if you're outside the jurisdiction of the Constitution, your rights are gone. So the idea is if we just shuffle people off in the middle of the night outside the jurisdiction of the federal courts, you cannot apply the Constitution. It's the Salvadoran rule of law, pursuant to Bukele's point of view, that is now controlling the fate of these individuals. The First Amendment, I mentioned free speech. You might have heard the Trump administration, in an unprecedented way, is basically threatening and withholding funding to universities, threatening retaliation against law firms, purging diversity, equity, and inclusion programs within the government, unless these institutions and these individuals comply with certain ways of speaking. Nothing about diversity, meaning race-related or gender-related type programs. I actually have a friend who's a big Democratic lobbyist in the United States. She's one of my best friends. She represents a university in Massachusetts, and they lost funding for scientific work that involved rats, because the program for this work required diverse species of rats. So the word diversity pulled the federal funding for her client. Universities and law firms. You've probably seen student visas being revoked, but students being picked up by the government for having, at some point, sometimes, years ago, taken a stand in support of the rights of Palestinians or in somehow critical of the Israeli government. This is core First Amendment stuff. Law firms, if they represent people who the Trump administration does not like, for example, Special Counsel Jack Smith, who investigated and indicted him in two places, in Florida as well as in Washington, D.C., pulling their security clearances, not letting them into federal buildings, canceling federal contracts. So far, sadly, law firms have, to some degree, succumbed to this pressure, and in exchange also pledged $1 billion worth of free legal services to Donald Trump for what he identifies as pro bono projects. Recently, he issued an executive order that basically directs his defense secretary and his attorney general to look into ways to supplement or support state and local law enforcement with the military, the U.S. military. So it's a picture of federal troops in the streets. He says in the executive order, if there's lawsuits against these law enforcement officials, these private law firms will represent the government officials. Appropriations clause. This is the power of the purse. You might have heard of a guy by the name of Elon Musk running around, demolishing agencies, slashing budgets. the Appropriations Clause of the Constitution, one of the checks and balances, gives the power to Congress to decide how money is spent. And after Richard Nixon abused that authority, it was perceived as being abusive, by refusing to spend money, Congress passed legislation to underscore that if you don't want, as president, to spend money a certain way, you got to go back to Congress and get the law changed. It was Donald Trump's refusal to spend money appropriated to support Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion that got Donald Trump impeached the first time. Right now, slashing federal programs willy-nilly without any legislative authority. Appointment and removal. Appointment is you hire and fire people if you own a business. That's how you get your business running. You want to make sure people are really good. And if they're bad, you fire them. That's what the Constitution gives the president the power to appoint folks with Senate confirmation. Elon Musk was not appointed with any Senate buy-in at all. There also, the Supreme Court's held removal, firing people, is not in the Constitution. So in a lot of instances, Congress has constrained president's ability to fire people for political reasons. That's gone by the wayside with this particular administration. Lots of people who are protected legally have been fired. Emoluments clause. The Trump family has made billions of dollars, pursuant to a recent study, billions on the two cryptocurrency meme coins for him and the First Lady, as well as an exchange, a crypto exchange that was established that the Trump family has a majority interest in. It was established back in October of 2024. Critics have said this is literally a pay-for-play. Buy the crypto. 75% of the transaction fees go directly to the Trump family. And the theory is you get favors out of the federal government so long as you line the president's pockets. The emoluments clause, there's two of them in the Constitution, bans gifts to presidents for logical reasons. Then we've got Congress's power just to make laws. There's over 100 lawsuits mounting, challenging the president. The White House is just ignoring acts of Congress. The Privacy Act, for example, one thing that Elon Musk's Doge did was go in and rifle through private records of people like me. If you filed a tax return, you get a refund. You turn over your bank account information. That has been exposed now by non-government employees, handpicked by Elon Musk. And in this moment, the American people don't know who has what and where it went. One federal judge in Washington has ordered the government to at least give some information about what's going on with our personal data and our personal information. There are other laws. And then there's this last question. I know the talk is in part about the judiciary, is the basically blowing through court orders. Now, Abrego Garcia from Maryland, the lower federal court judge, directed that he be returned to the United States. The Trump administration admitted that he was illegally deported. There was actually a court order from 2019 banning his deportation to El Salvador. Trump, in a interview on Sunday with Kristen Welker on NBC's Face the Nation, when asked if he has to abide by the U.S. Constitution, his answer was, I don't know. That's what he said. I don't know. It's up to my lawyers, and it's up to Bukele what he wants to do in El Salvador. The Supreme Court has waffled a little bit on this. I can explain that in some detail. The first decision kind of gave the Trump administration a loophole. Then Easter, I think it was, at midnight, in a different case, the Supreme Court issued an emergency order saying no more deportations. I think that signaled the court understands that there are some issues with its authority being adhered to in this moment. There's also been many lower federal court judges that have issued orders. The Republicans in the Congress have started impeachment proceedings against these judges. There was even recently Trump-affiliated private parties who sued the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Roberts, and is asking a federal court for a declaration that he actually is within the chain of command of the executive branch and must answer to the president. So we're seeing all of this separation, the three branches being consolidated into one branch. The United States Congress, which is now controlled by both branches of both branches or houses are controlled by the Republicans, are going along with this and actually enabling it. So that branch not issuing tickets for speeding. Then you've got the judiciary, but they don't have an army. They don't have a law enforcement mechanism. Their violations of federal court orders are enforced by the United States Marshal Service, which is controlled by the president. So one of the issues we have now is that the law enforcement apparatus and the military at the federal level all answers to the president. So there isn't an independent mechanism other than political will, maybe the voters, but the Republicans are a far cry in the Congress from putting any pressure on the president. There really isn't any mechanism in this moment other than the idea that at some point Donald Trump will just stop. He'll say, I have enough power. Because, again, there's not mechanisms to stop it. So Supreme Court rulings, they did one on USA. There's one on not paying USAID contracts, ruled against the president with a couple of dissents. Firing of a top government watchdog official, ruled against the president. Albrego Garcia made it clear due process does apply. He still is in El Salvador. And then a couple under the Aliens and Enemies Act, which is a statute from the 19th century, which is being used by the administration to justify ignoring the actual United States Constitution, which requires notice and some kind of hearing before liberty is taken away. You're put in a prison in El Salvador. Now, some Americans, and I do a lot of TV and radio, but also interactive television programs. A lot of Americans believe that if you're an immigrant, particularly if you're in the United States and you're not documented, you don't have constitutional rights. That's actually not correct. At the border, there are differences between a U.S. citizen and a non-citizen at the border. But once you're in the United States, full constitutional rights for non-citizens. In fact, there's Supreme Court case law that says that courts should be more protective of non-citizens because they don't have a way of ensuring that their rights are protected through voting. So they're more vulnerable, not less vulnerable, than U.S. citizens once inside the United States. So this is the docket sheet. This is the midnight order. There wasn't a decision or written opinion by the majority. It just entered on the court record. There is before the court an application on behalf of a putative class of detainees seeking an injunction against their removal under the Alien Enemies Act. The matter is currently pending before the Fifth Circuit, the Intermediate Court of Appeals. Upon action of the Fifth Circuit, the government, fast forward, government's directed not to remove any member of the class of detainees from the United States until further order of this court. The Fifth Circuit, which is very, very right-wing, had declined to rule on this. They were just going to let it sit there, it appeared to be, and the government took the position, we are not going to deport these people. The Supreme Court didn't believe the government, which is why they issued this order. The American Civil Liberties Union was representing these detainees, filed an emergency petition in the middle of the night and said, listen, they're saying that to the judge, but we hear the plane is going to take off with these people. And another federal judge had been had directed the first plane to turn around and not, and Trump administration ignored it. So I think this is significant. It demonstrates, there were two dissenting opinion. Justice Alito filed a dissent. Justice Thomas joined the dissent. But there were 7 justices who I think are indicating here they don't trust the White House to comply with the Due Process Clause and its prior rulings that these folks do get a notice and a hearing. Okay, so how did we get here? And I apologize for the typo. It should say Supreme Court's role, not roller, which is also misspelled, but whatever, if it was roller. So I mentioned Trump versus United States, right? I'm a mother of 4. I have 4 daughters. And if you have children, if you've got a rule, no eating pizza in the living room, but you allow them to eat it one time, the rule's gone, right? There's no rule. They understand you're not serious about it. And that's basically what the Supreme Court said. We have all these rules, President, but there's no way anyone's going to enforce them. You cannot overstate, in my mind, the significance of this ruling. It was a game changer, and it actually defied 2 other express provisions of the Constitution. The Supreme Court, in my view, and other experts, amended the Constitution unilaterally. 5 justices on the Supreme Court. That is arguably a problem with our system of separated powers. Why does the Supreme Court have so much power? And how is it that it hasn't been abused in this way? How is it that presidents haven't abused it in this way? Some might say a lot of the rule of law or the U.S. Constitution is a handshake, a gentleman's agreement, an understanding that you just do the right thing within certain limits. That's then, this is now. Then we have voting rights cases. So for hundreds of years, people of color were enslaved in the United States. A civil war was fought over that. They were given rights to full citizenship. They had 3/5 citizenship under the original Constitution. They were not considered whole human beings. They were considered property. But there were all kinds of maneuvers to keep them from the ballot. And some historians argue that it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s that full democracy took hold in the United States, where there were mechanisms to make sure that states gave people of color the right to vote consistent with the U.S. Constitution. I won't go through all these, but I'll list them. These are the cases where the Supreme Court has slowly, since 2010, dismantled key provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the McCain-Feingold statute that was about keeping big money out of politics. So this demise or degradation or backsliding of American democracy did not begin with Donald Trump. It started long before. And then the other thing the Supreme Court did in 2023 in a case involving Harvard and the University of North Carolina is it declared what's known as affirmative action unconstitutional. What's affirmative action? It's not quotas for African Americans. It's just taking, University of North Carolina had 40 factors to decide who gets in the school. One of them was race. The idea being, listen, if you come from a family that didn't have the kind of privilege, structural privilege, historical privilege that white people did who were not enslaved, and all things being equal, maybe we'll bring you in, we'll admit you over someone else. The Supreme Court declared the Constitution colorblind in this ruling. It not just said affirmative action admissions policies are unconstitutional, but it said the Constitution itself is colorblind. So I would say there's a direct connection between that ruling and this purge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that does account for color, skin color, in federal programs. Other factors, Newt Gingrich, he was House Majority Leader, or Speaker, excuse me, in 1994. In the wake, and he was Republican, in the wake of a lot of legislative victories under Democrats, Congress was kind of locked down by Democrats. He used funding of the government to force us, the other side, the Democrats, into submission around cultural issues and other issues. That was the first time under Bill Clinton the federal government was shut down. He also shortened the work week. My friend who I mentioned, who's a lobbyist, said, you know, when she was on the Hill back then, everybody was friends. Everybody talked to each other. Staffers, Republican staffers, Democratic staffers, they'd have lunch, they'd go out for a beer. No one talks anymore. The Supreme Court nomination process. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, well-known liberal justice, was confirmed by the U.S. Senate with almost 100% of the vote, Democrats and Republicans. Under Mitch McConnell, Republican Senate Majority Leader, the 60% majority required to put a Supreme Court justice on the court was moved to 50%, a bare majority. The last few have been put on with a bare majority, very polarized. Meanwhile, the last 4 nominations, estimates are that $40 million in political advertising went to put those justices on the Supreme Court or to keep Merrick Garland, Obama's pick, off. So the Supreme Court process has become highly politicized in the last few years. The framers of the Constitution did think impeachment mattered. It was a ticket for speeding. We saw Bill Clinton's impeachment fail. We saw 2 by Donald Trump. It's not something that presidents worry about anymore, so long as they have a Senate majority from their same party. January 6, 2021. Many people thought, I mean, the Republicans in Congress, their lives were at risk. Mitch McConnell, then Senate Majority Leader, stood on the Senate floor, pointed the finger at Donald Trump and said, the courts will take care of this. And then Kevin McCarthy, House Majority Leader, went down to Mar-a-Lago, made nice with Donald Trump, and then the Republican Party fell in line behind Donald Trump after that. Also, pivotal moment, January 6th. The question was, is there going to be accountability in the Congress for this? And the answer ultimately was no. Jack Smith, I mentioned the thought experiment I did in 2022 with my students. The last mechanism of accountability, an indictment. Jack Smith, we had 2 indictments of the federal government, one for January 6th, one for taking classified records to Mar-a-Lago. The Supreme Court and the judge in the Mar-a-Lago case basically stopped those cases in their tracks. Then we've got the immunity ruling, indictment no longer functions. And then this is a big one, disinformation and misinformation. Years ago when I was in the BBC's green room in Washington, D.C., about to go on television, in the green room there was a member of the U.S. Congress, a Republican from the Nixon years. He said he was one of the first to go into the White House and tell Nixon he was finished. This was his own party. And he resigned, of course, instead of facing impeachment conviction and undoubtedly an indictment. And he said the big difference between then and now is that the American people got one story out of the Washington Post and New York Times. There was one set of facts. CBS News, 60 Minutes. Everybody heard the story and the public lost faith in the president. Now, algorithms give everybody a different news feed, and the algorithms sort that based on what the computer believes to be our preconceived biases in one way or the other politically. So we're getting this echo chamber, and there is not a mechanism to sort truth from lies. And a significant majority of Americans get their news from right-wing outlets, Fox News, now Instagram, Facebook. You probably saw the Silicon Valley executive standing behind Donald Trump at his inauguration in front of his actual cabinet members. And of course we saw Elon Musk in the White House. American democracy, you cannot understand American democracy's failure right now without taking into account the fact that people get really bad information. Okay, I mentioned the unitary executive theory, so I won't go into that. But I wanted to add one other, I think, significant executive order that came out recently, which is the repeal of unlawful regulations. Congress gives agencies the power to make laws. Congress decides on how much authority they have to make these laws. We call them regulations. Donald Trump has issued an executive order basically giving him the authority to override all of these regulations, pick and choose which are good, which are bad. Upwards about 3,000 a year are enacted. So there's many, many, many. He's absorbing this power that Congress established for executive branch agencies. And then this is the complaint that I mentioned, where Chief Justice Roberts has been sued for a declaration that he too falls within the chain of command to the president. He's going to lose that one for sure, but that doesn't mean that this steady expansion of the belt and suspenders of the executive branch of the U.S. presidency won't stick around. All right, so where do we go from here? I get this question a lot. I answered it in many, many different ways before November 5th, 2024, which of course was Election Day in the United States of America. I encourage groups whenever I speak to tell me which pieces of this story I'm missing. I was at a talk earlier today that I did at the Max Planck Institute. Someone said, well, what about the states? The states have their own authority, their own prerogative. They can push back. Or what about elections? I have critiques of those in terms of actually disincentivizing Donald Trump in this moment. But they're still there. We still have a free press. We still have a judiciary that is functioning for now. And I have this talk I mentioned in Florida. How did we get to the point in this talk? People will Google me and they'll see I'm not a MAGA person. I get people mad at me from the right and mad at me from the left. I get hate mail on both sides, so I figure I'm doing something right and making everybody mad, so that's fine. I also get nice things. It's not just that. But I've asked, so how did we get to this happy moment or this moment of unity? And I started by talking about values, connecting with these people on a human level. Talked about my grandparents, my grandmother, who actually was Ukrainian. Her parents came over to the United States when her siblings were small. She was born in Pennsylvania in poverty. Just tried to tell them how I learned my values from this generation that didn't have this elite fancy education that I happen to have. And they really related to that. And I think I want to end with Abraham Lincoln because this is a president who actually did defy the United States Constitution. He engaged in the Civil War without a declaration from Congress. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which is the ability to challenge your confinement, your imprisonment. He suspended it. That's unconstitutional. He was not allowed to do that. That's Congress's authority, but he did it to keep the Union together. And he, for a lot of his presidency and part of the war, his goal, and I'm not a historian, but I'm citing in part Noah Feldman, who's a constitutional scholar, I think at Stanford, and also Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's written a lot about Lincoln. Most of his presidency, his goal was to keep the Union together. Of course, the South seceded from the Union over slavery, and his election, and the thought that slavery would not be able to extend into the Western territories of the United States. And of course, it was a huge economic powerhouse. So Lincoln understood when he took office that that's what the goal was. And he also understood, I mentioned the Due Process Clause, the Fifth Amendment, the 14th Amendment didn't happen yet, but the Fifth Amendment, due process protects life, liberty, and property. And at that point, enslaved people were property. They were considered property. So he knew he had no authority to do anything about people's property. But nonetheless, at some point, he made a decision to create a new moral order. And ultimately, he signed what was a version of an executive order known as the Emancipation Proclamation that changed the course of American history and, at least on paper, liberated enslaved people in the United States of America. Professor Feldman talks about the breaking of this contract around property. He broke it. The breaking of the compact, he writes, justified breaking the rules the compact contained. Feldman writes, rupture led to rupture, and that rupture led to transformation. That rupture led to transformation. And so I don't know where we'll go moving forward in the United States. I don't have answers to the next steps, but we are rupturing. We're in a rupture. And my hope and my belief is that, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice, that Americans will, in this rupture, find hopefully a moral compass that will bring us to a place that maybe is transformed. Because American democracy, for some of the reasons I talked about, was not on a trajectory with or without Trump that was sustainable. So I hope that ends on a high enough note that not everybody's depressed at the end of this conversation. But I'll take questions if we have time.
Yes, we have time. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk and trying to find a high note at the end. I think you covered a lot of territory with your talk, so let's see if we have questions. Try to be short with your questions so that we have time for everybody. You can also do your questions or place your question in German if you want, and I will try to translate.
You were talking about the rupture at your last speech. What are you thinking about the opposition in the United States? To heal this process, you need an opposition. Where are the Democrats?
Yeah, thank you for that. My speech earlier today talked about that in particular. And there is not a meaningful resistance within the Democratic Party, the elected members of Congress, or frankly, within the populace. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is shock. One is also that we don't have, with the exception of maybe the civil rights era in the South, we don't have a tradition of resistance. We don't know how to do it. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, I'm on this Fulbright grant at Leiden, is to have these conversations. It's part of why I'm so happy to be here, to talk to people, experts and others from other parts of the world, to try to galvanize some of the expertise and experience that other countries have had with serious resistance to the kind of threat of fascism, which experts, Jason Stanley at Yale, who's now going to be at Toronto, and others have labeled it, have that expertise, and have used that label, fascism, for what's happening in the United States. The Democrats, I picked a lot on the Supreme Court, but I do think the Democratic Party is also partly to blame for this. Barack Obama, when his nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court, Merrick Garland, the last Attorney General under Biden, was basically denied any hearing. He didn't even make a speech. He didn't complain at all. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the Senate Majority Leader veto power over Supreme Court justices. He didn't push back. The last 4 years of the Biden administration, the Democrats controlled the Senate. the Senate Judiciary Committee had no hearings on the egregious conflicts of interest on the part of Justice Thomas, on the part of Justice Alito around January 6th, around billionaires and corporations with interests in cases pending before the court, giving out goodies to these justices. I'm not an expert, a political analyst or a political scientist, but I think the energy behind the Democratic Party is they're just not willing to take risks. And this also goes back to the election. As I said in the beginning, there's problems with the American electorate, but what happened wasn't entirely irrational, and that the Democratic Party promised things for many years, and the quality of life for middle to low income Americans has really plummeted. Americans are working multiple jobs for a minimum wage that's not a living wage. There's no pension. There's no housing security. There's no health care. There's no higher education. We have an opioid crisis. We have food deserts where you can't even get fresh food. And you wonder, people have obesity issues and diabetes. Bill Clinton signed the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which brought a lot of these union jobs, these lifetime positions that their fathers and grandfathers had built families on, sent them up overseas. So people are really in a desperate space in America, and the Democrats promise these things and they don't see change. Now, part of the reason they don't see change is because of this complex system, Newt Gingrich, this kind of pushback, but also there isn't an inspiring leader, and there isn't someone like a Lincoln who's willing to get messy with politics and with policy in order to achieve something greater.
Thank you. Do you think it would be better after the midterm elections coming up next year? My friends are hoping for that.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for that question. And I apologize for being another downer on that one. Americans did get very upset over the tariffs having a big impact on retirement accounts. And so I don't know the recent polling, but anecdotally, there certainly are people that supported the current president that are dismayed, disappointed, have thought that price of eggs would go down. It's gone up. And so I guess in theory, economists anticipate a possible recession in the United States. The ports are empty, which means goods are not going to come into the U.S. in the next few weeks, like happened in COVID, which means prices are going to go up. So when their Dunkin' Donuts latte is $15, maybe they'll be upset. So if you take that and say, okay, midterms, maybe the House of Representatives will go to the Democrats. I don't know the numbers, but my colleagues who are experts in the various races, chances of the Senate flipping are very slim just in terms of who's up for re-election. But even if that were the case, say you've got a Democratic majority in both houses, right? So then the question is, okay, can this issue tickets for speeding in the White House? What do they have? They can pass laws. He's ignoring those already. So I don't think passing a bunch of laws is going to make a difference. They can hold oversight hearings. The first administration, he ignored congressional subpoenas, and now ignoring subpoenas, if violations of that is enforced by Pam Bondi's Attorney General. So any oversight by Congress, he can just ignore. So then you're left with impeachment. That takes a supermajority in the Senate to actually convict. And then, of course, he would have to agree to leave. The difference between January 6, 2021, and now is that maybe he would be willing to invoke something to ensure that he stays. I don't know. I'm speculating. I have no idea. So that is definitely could energize things within the country. I think it would be great. I certainly support it. But I think we're beyond that, just putting the swinging the pendulum in the other direction like has been happening, since 1787 between the two parties. I think we're going to need something more radical than just another election to stop this slide into something that is antithetical to democracy. That's my view. And there's a danger, which as I mentioned during my earlier talk, there's a danger, at least in the United States, to painting a picture of just hang on, or things are, oh, look at these protests, this is great. Joe Rogan, this right-wing podcaster, came out against the deportations, blah, 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 because Americans have what I call this penchant for toxic optimism. A lot of them just want to sit back and do nothing. And if they can see that, okay, I can just wait this one out and doom scroll on Instagram, cat videos, I'm good. And I think that's actually counterproductive. We need people to be really afraid for their children, to come together with this kind of mass force that this gentleman mentioned, this real resistance. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I think business as usual and conveying that you can, like George Clooney, the famous actor, just did an interview and said, I think the midterms are going to fix this. We got through hard things in America. This is a different time. And 34 experts joined me in the New York Times and were agreeing with that sentiment. But thanks for the question.
Still J.D. Vance, and I think he's more dangerous.
Some people do think that because of his populist roots, and he's Yale educated and all these things. I don't think there is anyone in American politics with the charismatic, galvanizing power of Donald Trump. So whether J.D. Vance could carry the Republican Party and, such that they will fall in line with a refusal to abide by the Constitution and the rule of law for J.D. Vance, I'm not convinced of that. I don't know what the polling is in that. And so far, the American democracy has staved off kind of menacing Machiavellian instincts of humans, which is what Madison wrote about. So I'm less worried about J.D. Vance. It's like people were very upset, about Mike Pence because he was anti-LGBTQ. But he refused to thwart that election at the risk of himself and his family. He single-handedly really stopped an insurrection, a coup. I mean, it was all up to him, notwithstanding everybody thought, oh, he's so much worse than all these other politicians. I'm not so sure yet about J.D. Vance.
You said that the Supreme Court found the Constitution colorblind.
Yes.
So what would be the changes you would suggest in order to change that?
Well, there's a lot of discussion. Joe Biden commissioned a big panel of experts to talk about reforms to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's absolutely crucial there be reforms to the United States Supreme Court. It would not actually require a constitutional amendment. The Article 3 of the Constitution, which creates the federal courts, gives Congress, again, the United States Congress, the power to decide what cases it gets. So there's a lot of reform that can happen on the Supreme Court without a constitutional amendment. So, if I was, constitutional Santa Claus, where I could do what I wanted to the Constitution, I would certainly reform the Supreme Court with maybe a rotating panel of judges from other parts of the country. It doesn't say you need it doesn't say that it has to be someone with the name Supreme Court. You could have other federal judges who have life tenure. They're rotating from all throughout the country, weighing in on constitutional questions. So someone from Texas, someone from Florida, someone from California, that represents the entire country. The other major reform I would do if I could amend the Constitution, if I was constitutional Santa Claus, I would put a right to vote in the Constitution. It's not in there. And I think that really makes it easy for shenanigans to happen with politicians who then have influence over the U.S. Supreme Court. But as far as that decision in particular, we need a Supreme Court to reverse itself, just like it did with the affirmative action cases, and with Roe versus Wade, and with Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council. I mean, this court does not deserve the moniker conservative. It's not acting conservatively. It's actually quite radical. And so, you know, that's for democracy 2.0 in the U.S. once we get through the threats out of the Oval Office.
Yeah, so for the moment we have to live with the Supreme Court we have. So what is your hope that they at least will stop the obviously unconstitutional stuff like birthright, citizenship, or things like this, where you really just to read the letters of the Constitution and it should be clear what the result is. So, but will they overturn even this?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that point, because I've made that point in some of my writings. We don't need the Supreme Court to get out a highlighter or a Sharpie and just circle what the Constitution already says. They're to interpret ambiguous language, and birthright citizenship is clear as a bell. When the court takes these kinds of cases, I am always a little skeptical that it's going to come out the way some of us would like. The fact that it took the immunity case was not a good sign, and we saw it. That being said, the order I just demonstrated shows that there's some play in the joints. I think it'll come down to 3 justices: Justice Kavanaugh, the Chief Justice, and Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And Amy Coney Barrett, even though she signed on to the majority in the Trump immunity case, she wrote a concurring opinion that really took issue with some of the breadth of the decision. And she has been surprisingly more moderate than I think people anticipated she would be. So the jury's out. I'm not optimistic, but I'm not necessarily completely pessimistic, because you have to think they didn't think it would go this far. In Trump versus U.S., they were really worried about rogue prosecutors. They were worried about prosecutors getting out of control. They were upset that our president was prosecuted. They thought that was going to create a precedent where every president is just going to be prosecuted by the opposing political party. But what they missed about that, in addition to some plain provisions of the Constitution, is that prosecutors have judges that constrain them. Prosecutors have juries that constrain them. Prosecutors have appeals that constrain them. Prosecutors have bosses that constrain them. They have tickets for speeding. Presidents do not. And Chief Justice Roberts just didn't grapple with that reality in the majority opinion, nor did he, frankly, and I'll close on this, I keep dangling this unconstitutional aspect of Trump versus United States. The unitary executive theory is built in part on the following language: the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Faithfully executed does not mean committing crimes. That seems pretty obvious. Faithful execution of the law means adhering to the law, including criminal laws. Now, they're very smart lawyers on the Supreme Court. They might be able to get around that, but they should have, at least as textualists, engaged with that. The other provision of the Constitution is in Article 1, which talks about the impeachment clause, which is part of the impeachment, where it says high crimes and misdemeanors, but, and I'm paraphrasing, impeached officials can still be prosecuted. The majority's opinion assumes that high crimes and misdemeanors is only for unofficial acts. Because otherwise, the Constitution says if you're impeached for a high crime or misdemeanor around the abuse of your official power, you can still be prosecuted. That was the answer to immunity. It was in the plain language of the Constitution. The Justice Roberts basically said, yeah, that's there, but it doesn't make a distinction between official and unofficial acts, which wasn't a very persuasive analysis. So this is what gives me, I get a little queasy about the neutrality of the majority right now. But we can only hope.
Are you up for 2 more questions?
Of course, yeah.
We could also bundle some questions, so you take 3
Thank you very much. Very, very educational for me in particular. One question. Would it be possible that the President of the United States could suspend elections and the incoming president due to a national emergency?
No. I mean, the states have the authority over elections. Each state runs their own elections. However, we haven't had a situation. Well, we have, I guess, 9/11, where all the airplanes were suspended. We had the COVID pandemic. He does have authority under a statute called the Insurrection Act to declare what amounts to martial law. So he has no power to technically, or I should say legally, suspend an election, but he could make it such that you're not allowed to leave your house and actually go and vote. And a lot of states, I don't know what the numbers are, but some of the more conservative states have made it very hard to vote, like mail-in voting, ways of voting conveniently. So it's possible. Anything's possible in this moment. Yeah.
In essence, perhaps the elections, you're right. That point I skipped, that the states have that, but the implementation of the elections could possibly be delayed, postponed due to a national emergency.
Again,
still,
the states could, in theory, have their elections anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, there is the supremacy clause in the Constitution that says that federal law overrides state law, but that assumes there's no conflict. I mean, I can imagine we would have a patchwork of how things would go, right? Blue states would have their elections, red states would not have their elections. And then we'd have this question as to whether the outcome was legitimate. I mean, maybe the Congress would refuse to count the Electoral College votes if all the votes weren't in. In the Colorado case involving the state of Colorado, if you read about this, banned Donald Trump from being on the ballot because Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says if you've engaged in an insurrection, you're not eligible to run for office. The Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to allow Colorado to enforce that part of the Constitution because that's allowing one state to have this impact on the rest of the country's election. I think that's wrong, but I think that precedent probably stands for this proposition that it's all or nothing for a federal election to be legitimate. But we saw this with the 2020 election, and in this moment, millions of Americans still believe the 2020 election was fraudulent. Chris Krebs, who was the top federal election official under Trump, declared it that election safe and secure. And Donald Trump, one of his executive orders is one that singles him out in particular as someone that is, and I'm paraphrasing, an enemy of the state. So in addition to this patchwork, I think moving forward, people are going to have to ask themselves, do I push back and stand up for what's right and face the consequences or not? He's the one who has, he's got the big stick. He has the club. And I think that can't be, set aside as a marginal issue. There hasn't been a president historically that's been willing to use it in the way that kind of power, in the way he's willing to use it, in part because the Supreme Court has just anointed him a king in the immunity ruling.
Thank you. We'll stay tuned.
Thank you.
Hello. First of all, thanks for being here and giving us this introductory law lecture. Very interesting. And my question is regarding the fourth slide of yours, where we go from here. What would be the worst possible outcome if there's or does he has any limits to it, to his power, or what could we expect in the future?
Yeah, I mean, the best possible outcome is what one of the your colleagues in the audience asked before, which is that there's some kind of political pressure for him to stop. That it's kind of more behind the scenes. We have, American is a capitalist culture. Capitalism is God. Money is God. Corporations are God. Silicon Valley has a lot of power. The Supreme Court, in a case called Citizens United, basically gave corporations de facto control over elections because they can run as many ads as they want under the guise of the First Amendment. So I guess it's possible that at some point there's a calculus amongst the real power brokers that authoritarianism or autocracy isn't good for business, the bottom line. And maybe that will come from consumers. I don't see in the structure, though, in the checks and balances, I don't see a way out right now because the Congress isn't going to enforce its prerogatives and is not going to hold the president accountable, and the courts don't have an army. They don't have a law enforcement mechanism. So we'll have to see, as we've been talking about, this is why I speak about this and it frightens people, but we'll have to see if at some point there's enough energy within the American populace to say, no, we want democracy. And then I'll be curious and open-minded to see what kind of change that unfolds from that. But in this moment, I don't see any obvious way this is going to stop anytime soon.
So I fear we end not on a high note. Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's really an honor to have you here in Heidelberg with your talk and answering to all of our questions. I think it will help us, guide us through the next weeks to understand better what is coming from the US and also to decide what we want here and how we value our own democracy. So thank you very much, Kim, and thank you all for coming and have a good night.
Thank you.